Hello, everyone. Welcome back to This Is Why We Stand. Joe Archino back here, and today is April 6th, 2017, and to many people, that might just be another date on the calendar, but on this day 100 years ago, it was a day that changed the course of human history. And of course, I'm speaking to today being the 100th anniversary of when the United States entered World War I. And I think there are so many different ways to start this segment and to really delve into this topic, but I think right off the bat, we of course have to establish and recognize that for 4 years before this had happened, the British and the French were holding their own on the west along the Western Front, fighting the massive German army off. And of course, I think it's so easy to look at World War I and define it based on what happened on the Western Front alone. But of course, World War I was infinitely more complicated in bigger in scope than just that. I mean, you had fronts in almost every area of the world, and hence the name World War I. But I think, of course, to focus on the American side of things, because again, we were late to the party, and the way I kind of define it for anyone who's an American who's looking back at the war, because I think we don't really look at this war with the same level of analysis and depth as the British would or as the French would, because of course we weren't in the war as long. We were really only in the war for about a year and a half, but it wasn't our war at the beginning, but it became our war at the end. And I think that's something that, of course, President Woodrow Wilson kind of understood. He kind of gained on his election, his kind of promise was to keep America out of the war. Americans at the beginning of it wanted nothing to do with Europe's dirty mess, and I think as time went on, those feelings changed as German aggression became much more clear, and on the high seas, they targeted ship after ship, and many Americans lost their lives as a result of German aggression on the high seas. But more than anything, again, I always go back to that line, it wasn't our war at the beginning, but it became our war at the end. And of course, 1917, the war ended in 1918. We were there about a year and a half. And one of the amazing things, I think, is the American mobilization for the war. At the start, during peacetime, right before World War I, our army only had about 130,000 men. But by August of 1918, we had over 1 million men. When it was all said and done, over 2 million soldiers would have stepped on the battlefield on the Western Front. And again, I think it speaks so much to the incredible pace and ability to mobilize. And the Americans were criticized at the early stages of the mobilization because of how long it took them to really get a lot of numbers together. And I think to defend that, you have to kind of understand it in terms of the vast size of the United States. You know, we kind of take things for granted now because of how transportation has changed, but back then, mobilizing an entire country where transportation was still kind of coming along was not easy. I mean, getting all these guys and shipping them off all the way to Europe from the United States, from small town places like Cherokee, Iowa, was not easy, but we were able to get it done. And I think obviously the question comes to what would have happened if the United States didn't enter the war? Would Britain and France have been able to hold out? And I think you kind of have to look at this in terms of just the two of the most essential battles were the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. In both of those battles, they emerged eventually as in having elements of victory for the British and for the French, but they received so many heavy casualties during those engagements that it really crippled their ability to launch successful offensives. And when the United States entered the war, Germany was able to kind of stay toe-to-toe and even launch offensives of their own at the end of the war, which really gained a lot of territory. And, of course, we kind of measure World War I on being a stalemate, being two sides sitting in their trenches, making occasional attacks on each other, never really gaining any territory. But what the Germans did once they knew that the United States was coming on board, they tried to win the war and just throw everything that they had on it. And I was doing a little bit of research and digging, and I did find that in the months after the United States declared their involvement, Germany kind of knew what they had to do. They had to try to win the war now before they could commit all of their forces over to the conflict. And from March to July, they lost about 1 million men. And initially, in their spring offensive, they gained a lot of territory. They had made a lot of headlines, and it looked like their offensive was really working well. But while it was working well and while they were making a lot of gains in terms of territory, they were sustaining so many heavy casualties that they just couldn't keep up with that, especially with the United States that was going to be continuing to send over troops. And I think the U.S. legacy in this war is kind of picking up that final hurdle and being that final force to kind of see things through for our allies, and that's really what they needed. This was such an incredible war that shifted the balance of power for the rest of human history. And I think before the war, obviously you had empires, you had kings, you had all of these different places, and the maps of the world changed after World War One. Great Britain, of course, I think unequivocally is the leading world power in 1914 before World War I starts. At the end of World War I, Britain was, of course, still one of the guiding forces in the world, still arguably at times the biggest force in the world. But I think the United States emerged into the world's superpower after World War I because the French were decimated from World War I. Britain lost so much of its professional army in World War I. Germany, I mean, I think we kind of know what their story is after World War I, but the United States kind of became the mantra and the example of being the ultimate superpower after World War I, showing their military prowess on the battlefield, their industrial capabilities, preparing for the war, and just everything. But one of the things I did want to touch on as we reflect on it being 100 years since the U.S. enrolled in this conflict is, was it worthwhile? Was the conflict unavoidable? Could something have been won at the bargaining table to avoid the bloodshed? And I think a lot of people have studied this answer, and I think the thing that always comes back is just no. This was a war, no matter how horrific it was, no matter how many people ultimately lost their lives, that was just unavoidable. If you read it, there's a tremendous book called The Guns of August, and it really looks at the build up to the war and then the war's opening month. And if you read that book, you'll see that the rivalries between these European powers in the build up to World War I, it wasn't just something that sparked the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It's kind of the moment that a lot of people look at and say, well, that's the spark that kind of lit everything else. It was the powder keg that ignited World War I. But if you read the book, The Guns of August, you will see that the planning of World War I had gone in years in advance. Germany had been planning for something of this magnitude for years before the war actually started. France was right behind them. England was always knew something like this was most likely going to happen, and then it all kind of came together. But when it did all come together and these European powers kept on hitting each other over the head and just decimating one another, the United States stepped in, and they were the ones who were able to carry the victory through for the Allies. I think there are so many individual stories that kind of tell the entire chapter of the World War I portion of Americans' history. I think you need to look no further than the examples of men like Alvin York, men like Henry Johnson, Martin Treptow, certainly not one of the bigger names, but I think when you look at his pledge and just the words that he used to describe the belief that he had in that conflict, you see just how important this war was. And I think, obviously, did this conflict mean as much to America as it did to France and to England and some of Europe's powers? Probably not. But when you look at the soldiers on the ground for the United States who did all the fighting, like always in American history, they gave it everything that they had, and they saw the job through to the end. And I think the American legacy in World War I is trying to do, bringing our own examples and our own philosophies and our own principles over and ending a horrific conflict. I think there are so many examples of heroism through that war, whether you look at the British or whether you look at the French or any of the Allied forces. But I think the U.S., in the short time that they were there, they left something truly incredible there, and they brought American might and American courage over. And those things transformed the United States into the world power after that conflict. But that is going to do it for this special episode commemorating the 100th anniversary of the United States entering World War I want to thank everyone for listening. I'll have more content up on Instagram, up on Facebook, and up on Twitter. So if you're not following me on any of those platforms, I recommend that you check them all out now. I will have descriptions for all of those in the box. And until the next time, everyone, thank you for listening.